They said he was untrainable. The words still hung in the cold morning air inside the county shelter, drifting between the chain-link runs like a verdict no one wanted to question. The German shepherd stood at the far end of the concrete enclosure, tall and rigid, his silver and black coat bristling under the fluorescent lights, amber eyes fixed on every movement, as if the world itself had betrayed him too many times to count. A metal tag clipped to the gate read, "Intake number 47." But the volunteers had started calling him Ghost, not because he was quiet, but because he moved like something half here and half somewhere else, reacting to sounds no one else seemed to hear. 3 handlers had tried to work with him over the past month, and each time he had responded the same way, not with mindless aggression, but with a storm of fear that filled the room and left everyone stepping back. No one could get close enough to slip a leash over his neck without him retreating to the corner, paws scraping against concrete, breath coming fast and sharp like he was bracing for impact. 48 hours, the director had said. If no one stepped forward by then, they would have to make a decision they'd all been avoiding. Daniel Hayes wasn't there to adopt a dog. At 40 years old, with a broad frame shaped by years in the army and shoulders that still carried an invisible rucksack, he had learned not to go looking for attachments. His dark brown hair was cut short, faint silver at the temples catching the overhead light, and his gray eyes moved slowly, deliberately, as if measuring the room before trusting it. He had come to the shelter to drop off a donation from the hardware store where he worked part-time, a box of heavy gloves and duct tape. Nothing sentimental, nothing complicated. But then he heard it. Not a bark, not exactly. A low vibration rolling through the corridor, steady and rhythmic, the kind of sound most people would dismiss as a growl. Daniel stopped mid-step. There was something in that tone, something too familiar. It reminded him of nights overseas when the air would shift before anyone else noticed, when the ground seemed to hum beneath his boots just seconds before chaos broke loose. He turned his head toward the last run on the left. The shepherd's ears were pinned halfway back, not flat with rage but tilted in conflict, as if listening to 2 worlds at once. The dog's chest rose and fell in tight bursts, and when a volunteer passed too quickly in front of the gate, the shepherd flinched before stiffening again, eyes wide, scanning for exits that weren't there. Daniel felt the old reflex in his own spine, that quiet tightening he had carried home from the desert, the instinct to map every door, every shadow. For a long moment, man and dog simply watched each other across 10 feet of concrete and steel. No one else noticed the stillness that settled between them, the way the fluorescent hum seemed to fade into the background. "Careful," someone whispered behind Daniel. "He doesn't like eye contact." Daniel didn't answer. He lowered his gaze slightly, not in submission, not in fear, but in recognition. The shepherd's breathing shifted, just a fraction. Daniel stepped closer to the gate, slow enough that even the dust in the air seemed to move with him. He didn't reach for the latch. He didn't speak a command. He simply stood there, heart steady, as if waiting for the dog to decide whether the world still held one safe place left in it. The volunteer behind Daniel shifted her weight and folded her arms as if bracing for something to go wrong. The air inside the shelter carried the faint scent of disinfectant and damp fur, a sharp, clinical smell that did little to soften the tension pressing against the walls. The German shepherd remained at the back of the enclosure, muscles drawn tight beneath his coat, paws planted wide on the concrete, as though he expected the ground itself to betray him. Daniel could see the subtle tremor running along the dog's flank. Not rage, but restraint, the kind that came from holding too much inside for too long. He let out a slow breath and eased himself down until one knee touched the floor outside the gate. The metal was cool beneath his palm when he rested his hand against it. Not gripping, not demanding, just present. "You do not have to be afraid," he said quietly, his voice low and even, the same tone he once used to steady younger soldiers during long nights when sleep would not come. The shepherd's ears twitched. The growl that had filled the corridor only minutes earlier softened into something less certain. Daniel did not look directly into the dog's eyes. Instead, he studied the space just to the side of him, offering a posture that asked for nothing. Around them, the shelter carried on with its usual sounds, a distant bark, the hum of a ventilation fan, the faint scrape of a mop bucket rolling across tile. Yet within that narrow run, time seemed to slow. The shepherd took one cautious step forward, claws ticking lightly against the concrete. Then he stopped, head lowered slightly, gaze fixed on Daniel's boots as if measuring the distance between danger and safety. Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not fear, but memory. There had been nights overseas when he could not sleep because every small noise felt like a warning. He remembered sitting alone on a cot, boots still on, listening to generators thrum in the distance, waiting for something that might never come. He recognized that same vigilance now in the dog before him. "You are not wild," Daniel murmured. "You are tired." The words seemed to hang between them like a bridge no one else could see. Another step. The shepherd's breathing grew louder in the quiet space, a quick inhale through his nose as if testing the scent of the man kneeling outside his world. Daniel slowly turned his left-hand palm up and rested it flat against the floor. Fingers relaxed, leaving the decision entirely in the dog's control. A volunteer whispered behind him that this was not safe, that the shepherd had lunged at anyone who got too close. Daniel heard her, but he did not move. He understood that forcing trust was the fastest way to lose it. The shepherd's head tilted, just slightly. The rigid line of his back softened by a fraction of an inch. He stepped close enough that Daniel could feel the warmth of his breath against his knuckles. The dog hesitated, as if waiting for the sudden movement that always seemed to follow kindness. When none came, he leaned forward and brushed his nose against Daniel's hand. It was not a full surrender, not even close, but it was contact. A choice. Daniel felt something inside his own guarded heart loosen at that small, deliberate touch. He did not reach to pet him. He did not speak again. He simply remained there, steady and unshaken, allowing the shepherd to retreat if he wished. Instead, the dog stood his ground, amber eyes lifting slowly to meet Daniel's face for the first time without defiance. In that silent exchange, something shifted. Not tamed, not conquered, understood. For several seconds neither of them moved, as if the entire shelter had narrowed to the space between a man's open hand and a dog's cautious breath. Daniel could feel the warmth of the shepherd's nose against his skin, steady and real, and he resisted the instinct to respond too quickly. Trust, he had learned, did not grow in sudden gestures. It grew in stillness. The dog inhaled again, deeper this time, drawing in the scent of worn denim, cold morning air, and something older that clung to Daniel like dust from another country. Around them, the volunteers watched in silence. One of them reached for the clipboard hanging on the wall, as though preparing to record whatever happened next. Daniel slowly shifted his weight from one knee to both, lowering himself fully to the concrete floor so that his posture matched the dog's height more closely. The movement was deliberate, unthreatening, a quiet message that he did not intend to tower over anyone. The shepherd's ears lifted halfway, not pinned back in fear now, but alert. His tail remained still, suspended between uncertainty and curiosity. Daniel let his hand rest palm up, fingers relaxed, and spoke again in the same low, even tone. "You do not have to fight anymore." The words were simple, almost fragile, yet they carried the weight of someone who had once told himself the same thing and struggled to believe it. The shepherd blinked, once, then again, and in that small gesture Daniel saw something soften. The dog took another step forward until his chest nearly brushed the gate. His breathing slowed, no longer sharp and rapid, but measured. Daniel could sense the shift inside him as well, the old reflex that once scanned every room for exits beginning to quiet. He remembered long drives home from the base after leaving the service, the way he would grip the steering wheel too tightly whenever a truck backfired on the highway. He remembered the nights when sleep felt like surrender, in the dog's rigid stance, in the way his muscles held tension even while standing still. Daniel recognized the same battle. A volunteer cleared her throat softly. "We have tried everything," she said, her voice careful. He was found alone near an abandoned warehouse. No chip, no history, just scared. Daniel nodded without looking away from the shepherd. "He remembers something," he replied, "even if we do not know what it is." The dog shifted his weight and, after a brief hesitation, lowered his head just enough for his chin to hover near Daniel's fingertips. It was not submission. It was inquiry. Daniel slowly curled his fingers and let the back of his knuckles brush against the thick fur beneath the dog's jaw. The contact was feather-light, more question than command. The shepherd did not flinch. Instead, he exhaled, a long, steady breath that seemed to release weeks of guarded energy. Daniel felt it like a current passing between them. He slid his hand upward, barely grazing the side of the dog's neck, and paused again, waiting for resistance. None came. The volunteers exchanged glances behind him. No one spoke. The shepherd's tail gave the faintest movement, not a wag, but a tremor that suggested possibility. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, joints stiff from kneeling on concrete, and looked at the shelter director. "Do not schedule anything for him," he said quietly. "Not yet." The director hesitated, eyes moving from Daniel to the dog who now stood close to the gate, no longer pressed into the far corner. "You think you can handle him?" she asked. Daniel's gaze returned to the shepherd, who met it without the earlier storm in his eyes. "I do not want to handle him," Daniel answered. "I want to take him home." The word home seemed to settle over the space like a promise neither of them had expected to hear. The word lingered in the air long after Daniel spoke it, as if even the walls of the shelter were unsure whether to believe him. The director studied him for a moment, measuring not just his size or steady posture, but the quiet certainty behind his eyes. "You understand he has a history we cannot explain," she said carefully. "He startles easily. Loud noises. Sudden movements." Daniel gave a faint nod. "So do I." There was no edge in his voice, no drama, just a statement of fact. The shepherd stood close to the gate now, no longer retreating, his amber gaze shifting between Daniel and the unfamiliar faces behind him. The tremor in his body had lessened, though tension still lived beneath his coat like a shadow that refused to leave. The director exhaled slowly. "We will need paperwork. And a trial period." Daniel rose fully to his feet, joints stiff but movements unhurried. "That is fine," he replied. A volunteer unlocked the outer latch, while another slipped into the corridor with a leash held loosely in both hands. The shepherd's ears flicked at the metallic click, and for a heartbeat his body stiffened again, muscle memory surfacing at the smallest change in sound. Daniel noticed immediately. He stepped slightly to the side, placing himself between the dog and the cluster of people watching. He did not block them in a defensive way, only shifted the angle of the world so it felt less crowded. The volunteer hesitated. "He does not like leashes," she warned. Daniel crouched once more, lowering his height until his shoulders were level with the dog's head. "Let me," he said gently. The leash was passed to him, the nylon cool and smooth in his hands. He did not reach over the shepherd's neck. Instead, he let the loop hang open and rested it lightly against the floor, giving the dog time to study it. The shepherd's nostrils flared as he leaned forward to inspect the new object. His tail gave a small, uncertain sweep. Daniel remembered the first time he had stepped off a military transport back onto American soil, how even the ordinary hum of traffic had felt too sharp, too bright. Adjustment did not happen all at once. It happened in inches. "We are just going outside," Daniel murmured. "Fresh air." He slowly lifted the leash and, with deliberate care, slid it over the shepherd's head in one smooth motion. The dog froze for a second, muscles tightening, then relaxed when nothing followed except Daniel's steady presence. No sudden pull. No command barked into the air. The gate opened with a soft creak. The shepherd stepped forward hesitantly, crossing the threshold as if testing whether the world beyond would swallow him whole. Daniel kept the leash loose, allowing slack to fall in a gentle curve between them. They walked down the corridor together, paws tapping against concrete, boots following at an even pace. Outside, the morning light spread across the shelter parking lot in pale gold, the sky wide and cloudless above rows of parked trucks. A light breeze carried the scent of cut grass from a nearby field. The shepherd paused at the doorway, blinking against the brightness. Daniel stopped beside him and waited. No rush. No pressure. After a moment, the dog stepped forward onto the asphalt, nose lifting as he took in the open air. His shoulders lowered by a fraction, the rigid line of his back softening as wind moved through his thick fur. Daniel felt something ease inside himself as well, a quiet alignment between two beings who understood the weight of vigilance. The director watched from the doorway, arms folded, eyes narrowed not in doubt, but in cautious hope. Daniel walked a few steps toward his old pickup truck, parked under the shade of a maple tree. He turned and knelt beside the shepherd once more. "I do not know your name," he said softly. The dog's gaze met his, steady now, searching. "But we will find one." The breeze stirred again, carrying with it the faint promise of change, and for the first time since arriving at the shelter, the shepherd's tail lifted slightly higher, as if the idea of home no longer felt like a distant sound, but a real place waiting just ahead. Daniel opened the passenger side door of his pickup slowly, mindful of every hinge and creak, and the shepherd paused beside him, amber eyes scanning the wide parking lot as if measuring the distance to every moving object. A delivery truck rumbled past on the road beyond the fence, and the dog's muscles tightened for a fraction of a second before easing when the sound faded into the distance. Daniel rested a steady hand against the side of the truck, grounding himself in the familiar cool metal. "It is just a ride," he said quietly. "Nothing more." He did not tug the leash. He simply stepped up into the cab first and left the door open, giving the dog space to decide. For a long moment the shepherd stood on the asphalt, tail low but no longer tucked, weighing the unknown. Then, with a cautious lift of his front paws, he climbed into the seat. The old vinyl cushion shifted under his weight, releasing the faint scent of sun-warmed material and dust. Daniel closed the door gently, the sound solid but not sharp, and walked around to the driver's side. Inside the cab, the air felt smaller, enclosed, yet calmer than the bright parking lot. The shepherd sat upright, head high, ears flicking at each distant sound. Daniel started the engine slowly, letting it idle before shifting into drive. The vibration hummed through the steering wheel, a low mechanical rhythm that seemed to echo something steady inside his own chest. He pulled onto the road with measured care, avoiding sudden acceleration, the landscape rolling past in soft greens and faded storefronts. The town was modest, a handful of stoplights and gas stations spaced along a two-lane highway that stretched toward open farmland. Daniel kept one hand lightly on the wheel and the other resting near the center console, not reaching for the dog, simply present. After a few minutes, he noticed the shepherd's breathing begin to slow, the rigid line of his back softening as fields replaced traffic and the sky opened wide above them. Daniel remembered his own first quiet drive after returning home. How empty highways had felt like relief, how the horizon seemed to promise that nothing unexpected would appear without warning. He glanced toward the dog. "You did well back there," he said softly. The shepherd turned his head slightly, studying Daniel's face as if testing the tone rather than the words. They turned onto a gravel road that crunched beneath the tires, leading toward a small, weathered house set back beneath tall oak trees. The paint was faded, the porch modest, but the yard stretched wide, bordered by a split-rail fence and open pasture beyond. Daniel parked and turned off the engine, letting silence settle naturally instead of rushing to fill it. The shepherd remained still for a moment, ears alert, nose working as he drew in the scent of earth, grass, and distant hay. Daniel stepped out first again, then opened the passenger door and waited. The dog jumped down carefully, paws landing on packed dirt. A breeze moved through the oak leaves overhead, scattering light across the yard in shifting patterns. The shepherd stood close to Daniel's leg, not pressed against him, but near enough that their shadows overlapped on the ground. Daniel unclipped the leash and let it hang loose at his side. "This is home," he said quietly, as much to himself as to the dog. The shepherd took a tentative step forward, then another, sniffing the grass along the edge of the porch. There was no chain link here, no echo of concrete corridors, only the wide open space of a yard that had been empty for too long. Daniel watched as the dog lifted his head toward the horizon, ears forward, tail rising slightly higher than before. For the first time since leaving the shelter, the shepherd's posture did not speak of defense. It spoke of awareness without fear. Daniel felt the weight of the morning lift by degrees, replaced with something quieter and steadier. He had not set out to change anything that day. Yet standing in the soft afternoon light with a once guarded dog exploring the edges of his yard, he sensed that something unseen had already begun to shift, not through force or command, but through the simple decision to stay. The afternoon light stretched long across the yard, turning the tall grass into waves of pale gold that moved gently beneath the wind. Daniel remained on the porch steps, elbows resting on his knees, giving the shepherd room to explore without the weight of constant observation. The dog moved in careful arcs at first, nose close to the ground, mapping the perimeter of the fence as if drawing invisible lines of safety. Every few seconds his head would lift sharply at a distant sound, a crow calling from the oak tree, the low hum of a tractor somewhere beyond the pasture, and Daniel could see the tension rise and fall like a tide that had not yet learned the rhythm of this new shore. He understood that feeling. The first weeks after he returned from overseas, even the chirp of a smoke detector had felt like a threat. He had learned to sit still and let the sound pass without reacting, to remind himself that not every sharp noise carried danger. Now he watched the shepherd practice the same lesson in his own way. After several minutes, the dog drifted closer to the porch, glancing up as if checking whether the man was still there. Daniel offered no command, only a small nod and the faint curve of a smile. "You can rest," he said quietly. The shepherd hesitated, then patted across the wooden boards of the porch, claws clicking softly against the planks. The house behind them was modest, a single story with white paint that had weathered into a soft cream over the years. The screen door stood open, allowing the scent of old pine floors and coffee grounds to spill into the warm air. Daniel rose slowly and stepped inside, leaving the doorway open. He did not call the dog. He simply moved as though there were nothing to prove. A few heartbeats later, he heard the soft tread of paws crossing the threshold. The interior was cool compared to the yard, shaded by wide eaves and heavy curtains that filtered the afternoon sun into muted stripes across the floor. The shepherd paused just inside, ears high, eyes scanning corners and furniture. Daniel remembered his own first night back in this house after months away, how every shadow had seemed unfamiliar even though he had grown up within these walls. He walked toward the kitchen, retrieved a stainless steel bowl from beneath the sink, and filled it slowly with water, letting the stream run steady rather than abrupt. The shepherd watched, head tilted slightly, then stepped forward when Daniel set the bowl down near the doorway. He drank in measured laps, not rushed, not frantic, as though testing whether this provision would remain. Daniel leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely, allowing the quiet to expand. Outside, the wind moved through the oak branches again, carrying the faint rustle of leaves. Inside, there was only the sound of breathing and the soft echo of water against metal. When the dog finished, he lifted his head and looked directly at Daniel, amber eyes clearer than before, less clouded by constant vigilance. Daniel crouched slowly and extended his hand once more, this time resting it lightly against the dog's shoulder. The shepherd did not flinch. Instead, he shifted his weight and lowered himself to the floor, front legs stretched forward, chin resting between his paws. It was not complete surrender. It was something quieter and more powerful. It was a decision to stay in this moment without scanning for escape. Daniel felt a subtle release in his own chest, as if a door long held shut had opened just enough to let air through. "We will take it one day at a time," he murmured, his voice steady and unforced. The shepherd's eyes blinked slowly, and for the first time since leaving the shelter, his body lay fully at ease beneath the roof of a place that did not demand anything from him except presence. Outside, the light continued to soften, and inside the small house beneath the oak trees, two beings who had both learned to brace for impact began, in their own quiet way, to unlearn it. Evening settled slowly over the oak trees, turning the sky above the pasture into a deep wash of amber and blue. Daniel switched on the small lamp beside the couch, letting its warm light replace the fading sun rather than flipping on the brighter overhead fixture. The shepherd remained stretched across the living room floor, chin resting on his paws, eyes half open but alert to every shift and sound. When the refrigerator motor clicked on in the kitchen, the dog's ears flicked upward and his body tensed for a brief second before easing again when nothing followed. Daniel noticed the pattern immediately. The world still felt unpredictable to the animal beside him. He understood that predictability was earned through repetition. He moved deliberately around the house, placing a folded blanket near the far corner of the living room where two walls met, a natural pocket of safety. He did not command the dog to use it. He simply set it down and stepped away. After a moment, the shepherd rose and walked toward the blanket, circling once before lowering himself carefully onto the fabric. It was a small choice, but it spoke of trust. Daniel leaned back against the couch and let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. Outside, a pickup truck passed on the gravel road, its tires crunching loudly before fading into the distance. The shepherd's head lifted sharply at the sound, body rigid again. Daniel did not rush toward him. He spoke from where he sat. "It is only the road." His tone was calm, steady, never sharp. The dog's gaze shifted toward him, searching for confirmation rather than reacting to instinct alone. After a few seconds, his muscles relaxed and his chin returned to the blanket. The night deepened, and with it came the subtle sounds that only darkness seems to amplify: the distant call of crickets, the rustle of wind against the siding, the soft tick of the wall clock above the doorway. Daniel prepared a simple dinner, moving slowly enough that cabinet doors closed with muted thuds instead of abrupt snaps. He set a bowl of food down near the water dish and stepped back. The shepherd approached cautiously, sniffed, and began to eat, not in frantic gulps but in steady bites, pausing every few seconds to glance up as if confirming that the meal would not disappear. Daniel remembered ration lines and long waits, the habit of guarding what little felt secure. When the bowl was empty, the dog walked to the doorway and stood still, listening to the night air beyond the screen. Daniel joined him, resting one hand lightly against the door frame. Together they watched the dark yard stretch beneath the moonlight. A breeze moved through the tall grass, silvering the field in shifting waves. For a moment there was no tension in the shepherd's posture, only quiet observation. Daniel crouched beside him and let his hand rest gently against the dog's back. This time the contact lingered. The shepherd leaned into it, just slightly, the weight subtle but unmistakable. It was the first time he had offered that kind of closeness without hesitation. Daniel felt the warmth through his palm and realized that the house no longer felt empty in the way it had that morning. The silence inside these walls had once echoed with absence. Now it carried breath and heartbeat and the quiet presence of another living soul learning to belong. When the clock struck 9, its chimes soft and measured, the shepherd flinched only briefly before settling again. Daniel dimmed the lamp and lay down on the couch rather than retreating to the bedroom, unwilling to leave the dog alone on this first night. The shepherd lifted his head, watching him, then lowered it back onto the blanket with a long exhale. In the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the window, two figures rested beneath the same roof, each listening for danger out of habit, yet gradually discovering that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not standing guard, but allowing oneself to rest. The night held steady for several hours, deep and undisturbed, until sometime past midnight when the wind shifted and pressed softly against the siding of the house. Daniel stirred on the couch, not fully awake, just aware enough to register the change in pressure and sound. Across the room, the shepherd lifted his head at the same moment, ears rising, body still but alert. Moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, painting long silver lines across the wooden floor. For a few seconds there was only the low hum of air moving along the eaves and the distant rustle of oak leaves. Then a loose shutter tapped lightly against the frame outside, a hollow, irregular knock that echoed in the quiet. The shepherd's body stiffened instantly, muscles drawing tight beneath his coat, as if bracing for something unseen. Daniel pushed himself up onto one elbow and spoke into the darkness before the tension could escalate. "It is the wind." His voice was thick with sleep, but steady. The dog's eyes shifted toward him, searching for confirmation the way he had earlier in the evening. The shutter tapped again, and this time Daniel rose fully, walking slowly toward the front door. He did not rush, did not snap on bright lights. He reached for the handle and opened the door just enough to let the night air spill inside. The cool breeze brushed his face, carrying the scent of damp grass and distant soil. The shutter moved once more under the push of air, harmless and hollow. Daniel stepped onto the porch and secured it gently, tightening the latch so it would not strike again. Behind him, the shepherd stood just inside the doorway, posture tall but no longer frozen. Daniel turned and met his gaze. "See," he said softly, "only weather." He closed the door and walked back into the living room, lowering himself again onto the couch. The dog hesitated for a moment, then crossed the floor and lay down closer than before, not pressed against Daniel, but near enough that their breathing seemed to fall into the same rhythm. The house grew quiet once more, and this time when Daniel drifted back to sleep, the shepherd's head lowered fully to the floor. Dawn arrived slowly, pale light stretching across the pasture and filtering into the room in gentle layers. Daniel woke to the soft weight of a presence near his hand. The shepherd had shifted during the night, resting at the edge of the couch, chin near Daniel's fingers. There was no tension in his posture now, only a calm watchfulness that felt different from vigilance. Daniel sat up carefully, and the dog rose with him, stretching long front legs forward before shaking out his coat in a quiet ripple. Outside, birds called from the oak branches there. Sounds clear and bright against the morning air. Daniel opened the back door, and the shepherd stepped into the yard without hesitation, tail lifting slightly higher than it had the day before. The grass was cool beneath his paws, dew clinging to each blade like tiny mirrors reflecting the sunrise. Daniel followed at a measured pace, hands in his pockets, watching as the dog trotted along the fence line with a confidence that had not been there 24 hours earlier. When a distant tractor started up across the field, the shepherd paused, ears flicking, but instead of freezing, he looked back toward Daniel. The man gave a small nod, and the dog resumed his slow patrol of the yard. It was not complete transformation. It was progress measured in moments. Daniel leaned against the porch railing, feeling the warmth of sunlight spread across his shoulders. He had known storms that arrived without warning and lingered long after the skies cleared. But standing there in the quiet of a new morning, watching a once guarded animal explore the edges of a place that no longer felt foreign, he understood something simple and steady. Safety was not built in a single act. It was built in nights endured, in doors opened calmly, in wind explained rather than feared. And as the shepherd trotted back across the dew-covered grass and stopped at Daniel's side, eyes bright and unclouded, the house beneath the oak trees felt less like a shelter from the world and more like the beginning of something that neither of them had dared to expect. The morning unfolded gently after sunrise, the kind of quiet that feels earned rather than accidental. Daniel carried 2 empty bowls to the kitchen sink and rinsed them under a slow stream of water, listening to the steady rush as if it were a reminder that some things could flow without interruption. The shepherd lay near the back door, watching the yard through the screen with a posture that was alert but no longer strained. Every few seconds his ears shifted toward a new sound, a truck in the distance, a bird lifting from the fence line, yet his body did not lock into the rigid stillness it once had. Daniel dried his hands on a towel and stepped outside, the grass already warming beneath the rising sun. "Come on," he said softly, not as a command, but as an invitation. The shepherd rose and followed him toward the edge of the pasture, where the fence met a narrow dirt path leading toward a small stand of trees. Daniel walked at an easy pace, boots pressing shallow prints into the soil. He kept the leash clipped but loose, allowing it to hang in a gentle curve between them. The dog moved beside him rather than ahead, occasionally glancing up to measure Daniel's expression. When a gust of wind rustled the trees sharply, the shepherd paused, shoulders tensing for only a moment before he looked to Daniel again. The man met his gaze and continued walking without quickening his stride. The message was simple. The world is allowed to make noise. They reached the shade of the trees where sunlight filtered through leaves in scattered patterns across the ground. Daniel stopped and rested one hand against the rough bark of an old oak. "This is as far as we go today," he said quietly. The shepherd sniffed the air, then lowered himself to sit near Daniel's boots. The act felt deliberate, chosen. Daniel crouched and rested his hand against the dog's chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath thick fur. He thought about the nights he had spent pacing inside this same house, unable to sit still because silence felt too heavy. He had believed that tension was proof of strength, that staying alert was the only way to remain safe. Now, watching the shepherd sit calmly beneath a tree while wind moved freely around them, he understood that strength could also look like stillness. A pickup truck passed along the distant road, the sound softened by distance and leaves. The shepherd's ears flicked, but he remained seated, eyes bright, yet unclouded. Daniel smiled faintly. "You are learning," he murmured. They stayed there for several minutes, neither in a hurry to return. When they finally walked back toward the house, the shepherd's gait was lighter, his tail held a few inches higher than before. Near the porch steps he paused and looked up at Daniel again, something expectant in his expression. Daniel reached down and scratched gently behind the dog's ear, slow and steady. This time the shepherd leaned into the touch without hesitation, closing his eyes for a brief second, as if absorbing the simple reassurance. Inside the house, the light felt warmer than it had the day before, not because anything had changed in the walls or furniture, but because the air between them carried less tension. Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window while the shepherd settled near his feet. Outside, the pasture stretched wide and quiet, framed by the same oak trees that had stood there for decades. Nothing about the landscape had shifted overnight, yet something inside the house had. Daniel looked down at the dog resting against his boot and felt a quiet certainty take root. He had not tamed a wild creature. He had met him where fear lived and chosen not to add to it. And in that shared choice, beneath open skies and within steady walls, both of them had begun to remember what it felt like to exist without bracing for the next unseen threat. The day moved forward in quiet increments, the kind that do not demand attention, yet slowly reshape the atmosphere of a place. By mid-morning the sun stood higher above the pasture, warming the porch boards and drawing the faint scent of dry wood into the air. Daniel set a small toolbox on the front steps and began tightening a loose railing that had creaked through the winter. Each turn of the wrench was deliberate, measured, the metal clicking softly against the bolt. The shepherd lay a few feet away in the shade, watching every motion without the sharp tension that had once defined his posture. When the wrench slipped and tapped against the railing with a sharper sound, the dog's head lifted quickly, ears forward, muscles ready for a split second. Daniel paused immediately, not out of alarm but awareness. He rested the wrench on his thigh and looked toward the dog. "It is only work," he said evenly. The shepherd held his gaze for a moment longer than usual, then lowered his head back onto his paws. The tension drained as quietly as it had arrived. Daniel returned to the railing, moving just a bit slower, mindful of the rhythm he was setting. After finishing, he stood and stretched, feeling the familiar pull along his shoulders. The yard felt different now, not because the fence had changed or the trees had grown, but because the space between sound and reaction had widened. Daniel stepped off the porch and walked toward the mailbox at the end of the gravel drive. The shepherd followed without needing to be called, tail carried level, stride steady. A sedan passed on the main road beyond the field, its engine humming at a moderate pitch. The dog glanced toward it, ears flicking, then returned his focus to Daniel's pace. At the mailbox, Daniel sorted through a few envelopes and a local newspaper, then turned back toward the house. Halfway up the drive, a delivery truck slowed unexpectedly near the entrance to the property, its brakes releasing a short hiss of air. The shepherd froze, body stiffening as the unfamiliar vehicle idled closer than anything had so far. Daniel felt the shift immediately. He stopped walking and let the leash hang loose between them. He did not pull. He did not command. He simply stood there, feet planted firmly in the gravel, shoulders relaxed. The truck driver leaned out the window and called a friendly greeting before dropping a small package by the mailbox and pulling away. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute, yet it felt longer in the stillness that followed. Daniel crouched slightly and placed his hand against the shepherd's side. "It is all right," he said, voice low and grounded. The dog's breathing slowed, and the rigid line along his back softened. Instead of pacing or retreating, he remained beside Daniel until the truck disappeared down the road. When they resumed walking, the shepherd's steps were cautious but controlled. Back inside the house, Daniel set the package on the kitchen table and opened the windows to let in fresh air. The curtains lifted gently in the breeze, light dancing across the floor in pale patterns. The shepherd moved from room to room behind him, not searching for escape, but mapping the house with growing familiarity. He paused at the hallway mirror, catching sight of his reflection and tilting his head as if studying the image. Daniel watched from the doorway, a faint smile touching his face. "That is you," he murmured. The dog's tail gave a slow sweep, uncertain but not alarmed. In the early afternoon, they sat together on the porch steps once more, the sun warm against their backs. The shepherd leaned lightly against Daniel's leg, not out of fear but comfort. Daniel rested his hand along the dog's shoulder and looked out across the pasture where wind moved through tall grass in steady waves. He realized that what had once been a house filled with echoes now held quiet companionship instead. The world would continue to make noise. Trucks would pass. Wind would shift. Tools would slip against wood. But in the space between each sound and the next, There was now a shared understanding that not every disturbance required defense. And as the shepherd remained pressed gently against his side, eyes calm and clear, Daniel sensed that the true change had not come from control or command, but from choosing again and again to meet fear with steadiness rather than force. Late afternoon settled into a warm, amber hush that seemed to stretch the shadows longer across the porch boards. Daniel sat in the old wooden chair near the front steps, a folded newspaper resting unread on his knee, his attention drifting instead toward the open yard where the shepherd moved with growing ease. The dog no longer traced the fence line in tight, anxious patterns. Instead, he wandered in wider arcs, pausing to sniff at patches of grass, lifting his head now and then to watch a hawk circle high above the pasture. There was still alertness in him, but it was no longer the brittle kind that snapped at every shift. It was awareness without alarm. Daniel studied that change with quiet gratitude. He had spent years believing that vigilance was the only way to survive, that lowering one's guard meant inviting harm. Yet here, beneath an open sky, he was watching proof that caution could soften without disappearing entirely. A breeze moved across the field, carrying with it the distant sound of children laughing from a neighboring property nearly half a mile away. The shepherd paused at the sound, ears pricked, body angled toward the direction of the noise. Daniel did not call him back. He remained seated, posture relaxed, hands resting loosely together. After a few seconds, the dog glanced over his shoulder toward the porch, checking for reaction. Daniel offered none beyond steady presence. The shepherd turned back to the yard and resumed walking, the children's voices fading into the general hum of the countryside. As the sun lowered, Daniel rose and stepped down into the grass. "Let us try something," he said gently. He walked several yards away and crouched, tapping his thigh once, not sharply, but with quiet invitation. The shepherd hesitated, watching closely. For a heartbeat, the old reflex seemed ready to surface, that internal debate between approach and retreat. Then the dog trotted forward, covering the distance with smooth, controlled strides until he reached Daniel and sat squarely in front of him. The movement was not rushed. It was chosen. Daniel felt the faintest tightening in his throat at the simplicity of it. "Good," he murmured, not with excitement but affirmation. He placed his hand against the dog's chest, feeling the steady thrum beneath fur and bone. In that contact there was no dominance, no need to assert control. There was partnership. A pickup truck passed again along the distant road, this time at a higher speed, its engine briefly louder against the quiet field. The shepherd's ears flicked, and his head turned slightly, but he did not break his position. He remained seated in front of Daniel, eyes returning quickly to the man's face. Daniel smiled faintly. "You see," he said softly, "the world moves, and we stay." The light continued to fade until the sky deepened into violet and gold. Together they walked back toward the porch, the shepherd now moving at Daniel's side, without tension pulling at the leash. Inside, the house felt warmer than the air outside, carrying the scent of fresh coffee and sunlit wood. Daniel filled the water bowl once more and set it down. The dog drank calmly, then settled near the doorway where he could watch both the yard and the room behind him. Daniel leaned against the wall for a moment, observing the posture, the way the dog's body no longer pressed low to the ground but rested in a balanced stance. He understood that healing was not a dramatic transformation. It was a series of small decisions repeated until they felt natural. As twilight settled fully over the pasture and the first stars appeared above the oak trees, Daniel switched on the porch light. Its soft glow stretched across the steps and into the grass beyond. The shepherd lifted his head, watching the new circle of illumination form against the dark. There was no flinch, no recoil, only quiet acceptance. And in that gentle halo of light, beneath a sky that held no immediate threat, Daniel realized that what had once been called wild was simply a heart waiting for someone patient enough to stand still beside it. The porch light cast a steady glow across the steps, soft and unwavering, as night deepened around the house. Daniel stood for a moment beneath that light, listening to the layered quiet of the countryside, the distant chorus of crickets, the low whisper of wind moving through the tall grass, the faint hum of power lines stretching along the road. Behind him, the shepherd rose from his resting place near the doorway and stepped onto the porch, pausing at Daniel's side, as if drawn not by command but by choice. The air was cooler than it had been an hour earlier, brushing against Daniel's face with a calm that felt earned. He rested his forearms on the railing and looked out toward the pasture where moonlight now painted the field in pale silver. The shepherd stood beside him, ears forward, posture balanced, not rigid. A sudden sound broke through the stillness, a brief crack of something shifting near the tree line, perhaps a branch settling under its own weight. The shepherd's head lifted sharply, muscles tightening in reflex. Daniel felt it immediately. He did not reach out at once. Instead, he spoke into the dark with steady clarity. "It is only the night." His tone held no dismissal, no impatience. It acknowledged the fear without feeding it. The dog's breathing remained elevated for a few seconds, chest rising and falling beneath thick fur. Daniel slowly placed his hand against the shepherd's back, fingers spreading gently across the warmth there. The contact was firm enough to anchor, but light enough to respect. "I am here," he added quietly. The shepherd's body eased by degrees, tension unwinding like a rope slowly loosened. He did not retreat toward the door. He remained on the porch, choosing to stay within the open air rather than seeking cover. That decision, small and unseen by anyone else, carried more meaning than any dramatic display could have. Daniel remembered nights when he had paced this same porch alone, unable to rest because every distant sound felt personal, aimed, deliberate. He had believed that staying alert was the only way to protect what little he had left. Now, standing beside a creature who had known his own share of vigilance, he understood that protection could also look like trust. A car passed along the far road, headlights briefly cutting through the darkness before disappearing beyond the trees. The shepherd tracked the movement with his eyes but did not stiffen as before. His tail gave a slow, measured sweep against the wooden boards. Daniel exhaled softly, feeling the breath leave his lungs in a way that felt lighter than usual. "You are not alone in it," he murmured, unsure whether he meant the dog or himself. They remained there for several minutes, letting the night move around them rather than through them. Eventually Daniel stepped back inside, leaving the door open long enough for the shepherd to follow at his own pace. The dog crossed the threshold calmly, pausing once to glance behind him as if marking the yard in memory. Inside, the house felt steady and contained, the familiar creak of floorboards no longer a question mark. Daniel turned off the porch light and allowed the moon to carry the rest of the night. He spread a blanket near the couch once more and lowered himself onto it instead of the cushions, resting closer to the shepherd this time. The dog approached without hesitation and lay down within arm's reach, close enough that Daniel could feel the warmth of his breath against his wrist. Outside, the wind shifted again, but inside the room there was no flinch, no scramble. Only the quiet rhythm of two steady heartbeats, learning that safety was not the absence of sound, but the presence of someone willing to stand through it together. Morning arrived quietly on the third day, sunlight stretching across the living room floor in long, golden bands. Daniel woke before the alarm, aware of the steady warmth near his side. The shepherd was still asleep, body relaxed, one paw resting loosely against Daniel's forearm as if anchoring himself without even knowing it. For a moment Daniel did not move. He simply watched the rise and fall of the dog's chest and listened to the gentle rhythm of breath filling the room. There had been a time when mornings came with a jolt, when waking meant scanning the edges of the day for something to defend against. Now the air felt different. Not empty, not tense. Present. Carefully, Daniel shifted upright. The shepherd stirred, but did not startle. His eyes opened slowly, clear and aware, and when he lifted his head there was no flash of alarm, only quiet recognition. Daniel reached forward and rested his hand along the dog's neck. "Good morning," he said softly. The tail thumped once against the floor in a simple, unguarded reply. They stepped outside together as dew still clung to the grass, the sky pale blue above the oak trees. A thin mist hovered over the pasture, rising in faint ribbons as the sun climbed higher. Daniel walked toward the fence line, and the shepherd followed at his side without leash or hesitation. Halfway across the yard, a flock of birds burst suddenly from the tall grass, wings beating the air in a rush of sound. The shepherd froze for a split second, muscles tightening in instinct. Daniel stopped as well, turning slightly toward him but not reaching out. He waited. The birds scattered and settled again in the distance. The shepherd exhaled and remained where he stood. Instead of retreating, he stepped forward on his own and resumed walking. Daniel felt something shift in that moment, something subtle but profound. Fear had come and gone, and the dog had stayed. At the edge of the pasture, Daniel crouched and placed both hands on the shepherd's shoulders. "You are home," he said, not as a reassurance, but as a statement of truth. The words hung between them in the morning light. The dog held his gaze steadily, amber eyes no longer clouded by constant vigilance. There was awareness there, yes, but also something else. Trust. They stood like that for several seconds, wind moving softly through fur and fabric alike. Daniel straightened and began walking back toward the house. The shepherd moved slightly ahead this time, not out of dominance but confidence, pausing near the porch as if claiming the space with quiet certainty. Inside, Daniel filled the water bowl and set it down in its place without ceremony. The shepherd drank, then walked to the center of the living room and lowered himself onto the blanket that had become familiar ground. His posture was open now, paws stretched forward, chin resting lightly without tension. Daniel sat across from him on the couch, elbows on his knees, and studied the transformation that had taken place not in dramatic leaps, but in steady increments. He had not demanded obedience. He had not forced surrender. He had offered presence. Outside, a truck passed along the distant road, its engine steady and unremarkable. The shepherd's ears flicked once, then settled. He did not rise. He did not brace. He simply remained where he was, breathing evenly beneath the morning sun. Daniel leaned back and let his head rest against the wall, eyes drifting toward the ceiling where light traced soft patterns above him. The house no longer echoed. It carried weight now, shared and grounded. What others had once called wild had never been fury. It had been fear without understanding. And what steadied it had not been strength in the way the world defined it. It had been patience. As the day unfolded quietly beyond the windows and the shepherd remained at ease within the walls, Daniel understood that nothing shocking had happened at all. No dramatic command. No display of force. Only one decision repeated again and again to meet fear with calm, and to stand still long enough for trust to grow. And in that stillness, both of them had found something they did not know they were searching for, a place where vigilance could soften, and where staying felt braver than running ever had.